My name is David Shoemate, and I am the manager of Relic, the Ruth E. Lloyd Information Center. Introduce Dr. Peter Henriques. He's a good friend of Relic. He comes whenever we invite him, and we like to think of him as our resident Washington scholar, and we appreciate his support. I'd like for everybody to give him a nice warm welcome.
If any of you are interested in my new book, which is First and Always, I brought a few copies with me, which I'll be glad to sign if you're interested, for you or for someone who likes George Washington and different aspects of him. The main topic tonight will be two men, George Washington and John Adams. There's a beautiful library. This is the library room at the Fred Smith Library, where you have the six famous founding fathers. Three of them are Virginians, Jefferson and Madison and Washington, and then there's Franklin and Adams. And we're going to focus on the relationship between George Washington and John Adams tonight. And I had underneath the quote from John Adams, "I feel myself alone, bereaved of my last brother." I'm going to come back to that. In some ways, it's very true. In other ways, I think it needs to be modified, and I'll try to do that at the end of the talk. But there are a lot of reasons to expect these two men to be very close, like brothers. For example, they're both exceptional men. They both hunger for history's greatest prize, fame across the ages, what I call secular immortality. They're both about the same age. John Adams is 3 years younger than Washington. Both are devout and sincere patriots, willing, if necessary, to sacrifice their lives, and they both almost died in the cause several times. And each man really was a paragon of integrity and honor. Equally, I think, if not more important, they had a very similar political philosophy, these two men. They both believed in a strong union and an energetic national union. Both were skeptical about the natural goodness of man, and they saw more darkness than light in humankind. They almost automatically distrusted any philosophy that emphasized man's natural goodness. Now, while there were many similarities, there were clearly very different men as well. Of course, physically, they were strikingly different. George Washington, at 6'2", commanding, graceful, and powerful, was the epitome of a military leader. John Adams wrote, in describing myself, I find I'm but an ordinary man. And of course, they came from different backgrounds. Adams comes from Massachusetts Puritanism, and Washington from the Honor Code of Virginia. Adams was a Harvard graduate with a grasp of history, literature, art, and language that, as you study, is just frankly amazing, the amount of knowledge this man has. Now, Washington is much better read than many people realize, but he had little regular schooling and was always sensitive about his defective education. But I think key aspects of the men's personality kept them from developing a close relationship. Even though they respected each other, there are tensions that will develop partly because of their different aspects of their personality. Perhaps the most striking aspect of George Washington's, the historical George Washington, often overlooked, is that, interestingly, Washington, I like Joe Ellis. If you like historians who know how to write, Joe Ellis is one of them. He said that Washington was the most determined, ambitious, potent personality of an age not lacking for worthy rivals. While he was wildly ambitious, what makes Washington so interesting, he was simultaneously self-effacing and insecure. Hunger though he might for fame and honor, he also feared failure and its accompanying humiliation. Ambition and dread cohabited in the same complicated heart. And fear of failing and wrecking his reputation, which meant so much to him, made him particularly hypersensitive to criticism. Enemy bullets will not bother Washington nearly as much as criticism from right people thinking, especially about his integrity or honor. I mentioned Washington's gift of silence. In the words of his friend John Trumbull, Washington acted under a mask of the deepest reserve and assumed the most impenetrable character I ever knew. And the result is George Washington is the most fully concealed of all of the founding fathers. On the other hand, John Adams is quite different. Adams was the most candid and self-revealed of the fathers. If George Washington was ice, Adams is fire. You read Washington's diary, you'll learn what the temperature was, who came to dinner. You read Adams' diary, you get an insight into this man's psyche and soul, and they're really very interesting and a joy really to read. But no doubt Adams has significant flaws. I think probably the major one is excessive vanity. He confessed as a young man, vanity is my cardinal vice and my cardinal folly. Later on, Alexander Hamilton called it his disgusting egotism. And Adams never seemed to be able to curb his vanity or find a charitable spot in his heart for those who tended to outshine him. Adams is a contrarian. He almost seems to welcome confrontation and alienation. He almost courts unpopularity, which he viewed as a mark of distinction. I must be doing something right if people don't like me, because I'm telling them the truth. I'm telling them hard truths. As he said, popularity was never my mistress. I will level with the American people and tell them hard truths they need to know. As a result, he feels forever underappreciated. Adams laments what he called the eternal puffing and trumpeting of Washington and Franklin, and the incessant abuse of the real fathers of his country, namely Adams. Now, as we examine the relationship between these two men over the next 25 years, we'll want to find out that three things should be kept in mind. This relationship changes. It's not static. It's like a marriage. It goes through different stages. Two, because of the very nature of the men we're studying, we're going to know a lot more clearly how Adams felt about Washington than how Washington felt about Adams. And three, I think perhaps most importantly, if you're trying to understand Adams, you have to keep in mind there's a tangle of emotions that he feels towards Washington. He feels a sense of loyalty, admiration, almost awe. But on the other hand, there's resentment and there's envy. And it's a complicated mixture. One aspects will come through and then another. Now, as best we can tell, Adams first met Washington on September 28th, 1774, where they were in Philadelphia, both members of the First Continental Congress. And Adams is certainly predisposed to be impressed by Washington. He had recently written in his journal something he undoubtedly believed, where he wrote that Colonel Washington made the most eloquent speech at the Virginia Convention that was ever made. Says he, I will raise 1,000 men, subsist them at my own expense, and march myself at their head to the relief of Boston. Now, the anecdote is fiction. Washington never made such a speech, and would not have ever seriously considered acting as described. But one thing you have to remember, perceptions often trump a reality when what people believe has sometimes more impact than what is actually factual. Washington doesn't specifically say that he met Adams on this day, but he writes about the Massachusetts delegation and is very impressed with him, as his letters to friends show. Of course, the most important meeting between these two men comes at the Second Continental Congress, when John Adams will nominate George Washington to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And on the run-up to this endorsement, clearly Washington impressed Adams. Remember, Washington comes in his brand new uniform. He chairs 4 major committees at the Continental Congress, including the Committee on Rules and Regulations governing the new army that's going to be proposed. And Adams wrote at the time, by his great experience and ability in military matters, Washington is of much service to us. Years later, Adams explained and perhaps exaggerated his role in the appointment. He wrote that there was a Southern party that opposed the New England Army under the command of a New England general. Artemus Ward was then the man in charge of the troops around Boston. And John Hancock, as you can guess from his signature, is super ambitious, and he thinks he should be commander-in-chief. And when John Adams gets up to nominate the commander-in-chief, my tie right, yes, go on, Adams rose and said, "I have no hesitation to declare that I have but one gentleman in mind for this important position. And that gentleman is from Virginia," who is among Hancock's. Adams writes, Hancock's expression changed dramatically. Mortification and resentment were expressed as forcibly as a face could exhibit them. This is a crucial moment in American history, the choice of Washington to lead the nascent army. It thrust Washington in the very spotlight of history, where the glare will be on him for 25 years before his death. He's now, as Adams put it, one of the most important characters in the world, because the liberties of America depend on him. And Adams made clear why he so liked Washington at this particular stage, a gentleman of one of the first fortunes on the continent, leaving his delicious retirement, his family and friends, sacrificing his ease and hazarding his all for the cause of the country. But almost immediately, Adams seems to mope about the glamour that all of a sudden is surrounding the hero he helped create. Witnessing the pomp and ceremony as Washington and his aides got ready to go off from Philadelphia to take command of the troops, he wrote to his wife Abigail, one of the most interesting women in early American history. My next talk is going to be comparing Washington and Martha and Adams and his wife. I think it'd be fun to see how they're similar and how they're different. But he writes her, and he says this: "Such is the pride and pomp of war. I, poor creature, worn out with scribbling, for my bread and my liberty, low in spirits, weak in health, must leave others to wear the laurels which I have sown, others to eat the bread which I have earned." That's going to be a theme that pops up more than once, as we'll see. The relationship between these men in the first year of the war is very cordial. Adams was president of the Board of War. That's kind of like modern day Secretary of Defense would be. And when Washington is contemplating in late 75, early 1776, he hopes, this is where the British are centered in Boston, and Washington debated whether he would conduct an amphibious assault to drive them out. Probably would have been a disaster. But he's interested in getting Adams' opinion. He writes, "I'm exceedingly desirous of consulting you." On January 6, 1776, he invited Adams to a potluck dinner. "I shall be very glad of your company, and then we can talk the matter over at large." Adams, 10 days later, attends a council of war, and his name was written under His Excellency and above all the other attendees. A week later, Adams was invited to meet with a group of Indian chiefs. Adams wrote, he got quite a kick out of it. He said, Washington introduced him as one of the Grand Council Fire at Philadelphia, and they gave me very nice ceremonial bows. When Washington did drive the British out of Boston, thanks to Henry Knox and his getting cannon on Dorchester Heights, it was John Adams in Congress who proposed a gold medal for Washington to celebrate the occasion, something naturally pleasing. I think the clearest example of the closeness between Washington and Adams in this first year of the war came in the fact Washington, in writing to Adams, refers to him as "my dear sir." This is an interesting little tidbit about Washington that's helpful. I don't know whether he was even conscious of doing it. When he writes letters, he usually writes "sir." If he knows the people well, he'll write "dear sir." If he feels very close to them, he will write "my dear sir." Usually, relatively few people get that nod is for a select few. But as far as I can tell, this was the only time George Washington referred to John Adams in that fashion. Significantly, when he wrote Adams after his victory at Yorktown, his letter simply begins "sir," not even "dear sir." Clearly, things had changed. And I believe the change arose from the fact that Washington had perceptions of Adams' role in an event known as the Conway Cabal. This is a cabal, is a plan to overthrow Washington as commander-in-chief and to replace him with General Horatio Gates. Historians spend a lot of time and ink debating this cabal, how serious it was, and so on and so forth. Washington took it seriously. Now, we'll come back to that in his reaction to it in just a minute. Despite Adams' genuine admiration for Washington, by 1777, he's concerned on two different fronts about Washington. One is the extreme veneration that is being paid to Washington after his victories at Trenton and Princeton. Adams publicly frets about the way His Excellency was viewed. He declared in Congress, for example, that some members of Congress were disposed to idolize an image which their own hands have molded. I speak here of the superstitious veneration that is sometimes paid to General Washington. Although I honor him for his good qualities, yet in this house I feel myself his superior. In private life, I shall always acknowledge that he is mine. And Adams made the same point later in the year when he wrote that he was glad that General Burgoyne's army was defeated at Saratoga by Gates and not by Washington. And he explained that if Washington had won, it would have been idolatry, and adulation would have been unbounded, so excessive as to endanger our liberties. We can allow a certain citizen to be wise, virtuous, and good without thinking him a deity or a savior. Secondly, Adams doesn't like the way Washington is acting as a general on military terms, especially his efforts to defend Philadelphia, which was then the capital, when Howe's army marches upon it. And Adams is convinced that a better plan would have protected the city from being taken. And he lamented in his journal, "Oh, heaven grant us one great soul. One leading mind would extricate the best cause from the ruin which it seems to await us. But for the want of it, one active masterly capacity would bring order out of confusion and save this country." Now, some have interpreted that claim, one great soul, not only kind of blasting Washington, but actually thinking Gates is the one great soul. But when you read Adams' journal, it's clear he does not think Gates is the great soul. In my research, and obviously not conclusive, but I've never seen any concrete evidence that Adams wanted to remove Washington from command. He might a bit, but he doesn't want to remove him. And Adams, who is, whether you like him or not, is a man of remarkable integrity, later vehemently denied that he had any hand in trying to do so. In Adams' words, it's a scandalous lie. Now, Washington has left no written record in his reaction to Adams' possible role, but I think there's evidence to indicate that His Excellency came to view Adams with a certain amount of suspicion. No question, Washington has a long memory for his wartime critics, and he was aware that Adams had sometimes griped about his performance. I think it's also worth noting that John Adams was close friends with the famous physician Benjamin Rush, who was clearly a Washington critic and involved in the cabal. And I think Washington's concern was no doubt influenced by a letter from his beloved Lafayette. Lafayette is as close to a son as Washington is going to get. Not a son, though. Washington has no sons, but he's close to Lafayette, where Lafayette wrote to Washington, "I understood that John Adams spoke very disrespectfully of Your Excellency in Boston. I don't know if it's true, but in that case, I should be very sorry to have given him letters for France." That comment, letters for France, refers to the fact that Congress had appointed Adams to go over to France to help negotiate the treaty, which gets negotiated before he gets there, that recognizes American independence. It's absolutely crucial treaty. What happens is it involves a meeting from Henry Knox. Henry Knox is probably Washington's most unabashed admirers, absolutely in every way, at least until later in their life. And Adams writes, "General Knox came up to dine with me before he goes away, and the design of his visit was clear. He wanted to sound me out in relationship to General Washington. Basically, he wants to know, are you going to badmouth the general when you go to Europe?" And Adams replies, absolutely not. He declared that the general was a perfectly honest man with an amiable and excellent heart, and the most important character at that time among us, for he's the center of our Union. And I don't doubt that's how Adams felt, but I believe Washington's concern on this subject was real and will have some impact on their relationship when they next meet 10 years later, when they are elected president and vice president of the new nation in 1789. And no question, well, everyone knows Washington. The only person who raises a question who might not be president is Washington himself. Everyone knows Washington, no friend of the Constitution would expect anyone else, and he's going to get every electoral vote. But who's going to be vice president is not as clear. And from principle, Washington would never think of running or anything, was not going to give his opinion on the subject. But I think some level of concern over Adams' possible involvement in the Conway cabal lingered. There's an interesting confidential letter from James Madison to Thomas Jefferson, where Madison writes, and it's important to remember at this time, Madison is Washington's most important advisor. Later on, it will be Hamilton, but in the Constitution and very early presidency, Madison is his most important advisor. And I can't help but believe that what Madison thinks and says has impact on Washington. And he wrote to Jefferson, J. Adams, so he's not Sam Adams, the more radical of the two, has made himself obnoxious to many, particularly in the southern states, by his political principles. Others, recollecting his cabal during the war against General Washington, knowing his extravagant self-importance, conclude that he would not be a very cordial second. That might be a fair letter, but it could be one with influence. Now, on the other hand, people like Henry Knox, Benjamin Lincoln, both very close to Washington, write glowing letters about Adams, glowing letters about his abilities, and glowing references that Adams thinks very, very highly of you. So he's getting a mixture. The vote count greatly disappointed Adams. He viewed his 34 votes, little less than half of the electoral votes awarded to Washington, as scandalously low. And he's very sensitive to such things, as he expressed it. Is not my election to this office, in the scurvy manner it was done, a curse rather than a blessing? Is there gratitude? Is there justice? Is there common sense in the business? Is it not an indelible stain on our country, countrymen, and Constitution? I assure you, I think it's so. You can feel that vanity coming through in that kind of letter. Now, when you read the Constitution, the powers of the president are unclear, but at least the Constitution outlines them. With the vice president, it basically is a blank slate, with the exception that he will preside over the Senate and vote in case of a tie. That's it. There isn't anything else about it, except that he becomes president if the president becomes incapacitated or dies, but that's impeached or dies. So there isn't any framework for these people to work. So obviously, since they're in uncharted waters, the way things start and the way Washington wants Adams to work will be very, very influential. And it's really important that the relationship get off on the right foot. But unfortunately, it didn't. It comes in handicapped that the two men were not close in the aftermath of the Conway cabal. And then an incident known as the titles controversy comes up and greatly exacerbates the situation. Washington's overriding goal as president was to strengthen the Union. If you want to study Washington, what he does throughout his presidency, if you grab this thread, that's the thread that will guide you through. The best nickname for Washington is the Unifier. That expresses what he wants to do. And in that capacity, he's always striving to avoid unwanted controversy and unnecessary controversies. Unfortunately, the first such controversy centered on how the new president should be addressed, and Vice President John Adams is at the very center of that controversy. Adams believes he must have exalted titles for the president. It's absolutely essential that he have that. It has to be authority. If you don't have authority and if you don't have the paraphernalia of military and excitement and things, you will not have respect. And Adams went so far as to say the Europeans will they'll despise Washington to eternity if he's just Mr. President. And Adams actually wrote and said it would not be extravagant prophecy that the want of titles may cost the country 50,000 lives and 20 millions of money within 20 years. Now this may say, what's the big deal? At the time, it was a big deal. The biggest debate, Patrick Henry said the Constitution squints towards monarchy. And this seems to be confirmation that they're moving in that direction. So it is a big deal. It is a big deal at the time. And this title controversy, people get really ticked at Adams, they say, how about His Rotundity would be a nice title for Adams. And William McClay, who's an anti-federal senator from Pennsylvania, writes he loathed Adams from the first day he saw him. He said, God forgive me for the vile thought, but I can't help but thinking of a monkey just put into breeches when I saw him betray such evident marks of self-conceit. Not the kind, and Maclay has the advantage of writing a journal that was left and kept about this, so he gets quoted much more than people maybe on the other side and gets extra credit. President Washington's reaction can best be seen in an exchange of letters with his good friend David Stewart. Stewart had warned the president nothing could equal the ferment and disquietude occasioned by the proposition respecting titles. It has made Adams, quote, not only unpopular to an extreme, but highly odious. And Washington's candid reply makes his position clear. He was upset. It stirred up a question which he did not want to have stirred up for the very reasons that he feared. It's going to give the adversaries a club to use against us. And he said he didn't know anything about it. The controversy started before he even got into New York. It was not involved. I honestly feel that Adams' prominent participation in the titles controversy sours Washington's view of him as a skilled politician and consensus builder, and it damaged their already less than ideal political relationship. Now, I want to say, why did Adams do this? He does it because he believes it's best for the administration that the title be there. He wants the presidency of what he's a very loyal vice president, as loyal as you could be. I mean, his speeches to the Senate, praise, if I had time, this is a quote from a long praise, just full of the same kind of words. Where shall we find one whose commanding talents and virtues have so completely united all hearts and voices in their favor? He demonstrated his loyalty I was surprised to learn this, there were 31 tie votes in the Senate, and I think it's a record still standing, and Adams cast the deciding vote for the administration every one of the 31 times. But despite that loyalty, he's not in the inner circle. He meets with the cabinet almost never. When action is taken, like picking John Jay to go to Great Britain on his key mission, Adams, who had been our ambassador, is not treated or asked his advice. So he's out of the influence stream for the most part. But I don't want to over-exaggerate. They're not completely estranged. He's asked occasionally. They do certainly respect each other. And there's contact, sometimes formal, sometimes less formal. Abigail and Martha become good friends, and the couple actually double dates to the theater. And Washington had a rule of not going to private homes, which he broke for Martha and he to go to Abigail and John's house for dinner. Abigail loves Washington. I have a feeling she writes so many nice things about Washington. I have a feeling I'm like, he loves Abigail. She really likes him. I think it might stir up a little jealousy in Adams, which he has plenty of it already. But there's contact. When Washington took a tour of New England, a major tour to rally support for the Union, Adams goes with him part of the way and tours Harvard with him. That type of thing goes on. But Washington doesn't have a great deal of contact with him. Adams wasn't even asked to be vice president the second time. Washington never said he was running. They just let him. They just accepted the fact that they picked him, and Adams did win re-election as well. But Washington finally is not going to serve a third term. And then he looks closer to Adams as the logical successor to him. And it's interesting that in March of 1796, he invites Adams to the theater, even though Abigail is not there. And after a state dinner, Adams writes to his wife where he says, "He detained me there until 9 o'clock and was never more frank and open upon politics. I find his opinions and sentiments are more exactly like mine than I ever knew before, respecting England and France and our American parties. Interesting in the closeness of their views, but also interesting that Adams didn't even know about it until this session. That, I think, says something. And Washington obviously wants Adams to defeat Jefferson in the election of 1796, which he does by 3 votes. But Adams later wrote to Abigail, "I didn't know he was for me until Martha said, yes, he wanted me." Another sign that they're not buddy-buddy here along that line. Well, Adams wins the election in 1796, and he faces a daunting task as the nation's second president. For one thing, he was not the nation's first president, and what an act you have to follow to try to do that. And Adams, there's a book, a good book on Adams by James Grant called John Adams' Party of One. He does not fit into the traditional political framework, which is going to make it tough to be successful. And his lack of sensitivity, people wanted to celebrate Washington's birthday, even after he was not president, kind of like a holiday. And Adams makes a point of writing, "I take the earliest opportunity to write you to say I decline accepting it. Why should Washington's birthday be celebrated? He's out of power, and mine isn't, and I'm in power." Now, Washington leaves power, certainly initially, happily. He wants to get back to Mount Vernon. He loves Mount Vernon. He keeps writing forever. "All I want to do is live and die an honest man at Mount Vernon." But unfortunately, Washington's not made up to be that way. He is simply too ambitious. And Adams, who understands at some level, is very interesting. Now, some of the quotes I found, I have the last chapter in my book is What Made Washington Tick. And I found some very interesting quotes from Adams, which were making the contemporary point that I was trying to make, one of which he writes, "Washington soon found solitude more fatiguing, more disgusting, and longed to return to the public bustle again." To borrow a phrase from the wonderful Broadway musical Hamilton, if you haven't seen it, you can watch it on video. I was lucky enough to see Lin-Manuel Miranda in person. It's a wonderful show. Washington wants to be in the room where it happens. He is drawn to power and influence like magnetic filings are to a magnet. If anything is going to bring him back into the public sphere, it is the prospect of war with France. Jay's treaty smooths things out with England and ticks France off dramatically, and France proceeds to capture American ships in huge numbers. By the time Adams is president, over 300 American ships have been confiscated on their way to bringing goods to England, and some of our it's a real crisis. I mean, it could be: are we going to go to war with France? And Adams calls Congress. This view, I put this up because if you haven't seen or want to see the show with Paul Giamatti on the Adams saga, it's, like anything, it's got its errors, but it's an excellent show. I think it's on HBO. I can't remember which one it's on. I think you have to rent it, but it's well worth seeing. But here you have a case where Adams faces a problem with France somewhat similar to what Washington faced with England. Washington's Senate ambassador did negotiate a treaty, very unpopular, but it avoided war. Adams tries the same thing. He sends a group of 3 men to France. The incident is known in the history books as the XYZ affair, but it failed miserably. The American diplomats and envoys, they were treated in a very disrespectful and demeaning fashion. And when finally the American people, when the records were released, as how they were treated, the nation was really ticked. They collectively registered their indignation and went wild with anger at France. There's a great quote, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. We're not going to give in to bribery from France. And this explosion of patriotic fervor led to several important events. The Republican Party, led by Jefferson, suffered a real blow. As Abigail Adams put it, they were struck dumb. And John Adams found for the only time in his presidency, he was popular. And like all people who don't want popularity, he revels in it. When it's his turn, they write him poems and cheer him in the theater and write songs, name a ship for him, and that kind of thing. And the stage is set for the last crisis between the two men, and that involves the near war with France. Since it looks like a war, they raised an army, and the question is, who's going to lead it? And who is more logical to lead it than George Washington? George Washington's kind of more eager than you would think. He wrote a Dear Sir letter to Adams, invited him to Mount Vernon during the crisis, praised him for his position. And Adams wrote back and said, we must have your name if you'll let us use it. There's more efficacy than in many an army. And so, without getting Washington's full permission, he appoints him, or has the Senate unanimously, as always with Washington, he gets every vote in every time he's involved. He is now the lieutenant general and commander-in-chief of all the armies to be raised in America. But the stage is set for trouble. Where often trouble lurks, Alexander Hamilton is not too far away. And the problem comes from the fact that Washington wants Hamilton to be second in command, and John Adams desperately does not want him to be second in command. From Washington's perspective, I should be able to pick who I want, but he really undercuts presidential authority. I'm sure if the roles had been reversed, Washington would not have put up with what he expected Adams to put up with. And Adams is outraged because he's come to despise Hamilton. One of the many quotes that I could give you, Hamilton was the most reckless, impatient, artful, indefatigable, unprincipled intriguer in the United States, if not in the world. Is that the guy you want to be in effect de facto commander of the army? But he's basically trapped. He needs Washington, and he eventually, after a lot of fiddling and fondling, he allows Hamilton to become second in command. As he later explained, I was no more at liberty than a man in prison, chained to a floor and bound hand and foot. But that's what happened. Now, ultimately, the quasi-war with France ends more with a whimper than a bang. Adams might have lost control of the army, but he controls the peace process. He has word that the French now will treat us with respect. He bucks the war element of his own party. He sends another group of envoys to France, and they will end the quasi-war with France. Not quite in time before the election of 1800, which Adams is going to lose to Jefferson. And as the election is running up, many Federalists, Adams is the Federalist Party, Jefferson the Republican, want Washington to come out of retirement and save the party. And Adams, right, he would have done it, and he says he would have run, he would have won. I'm glad he didn't run. Of course, as most of you know, he's not going to run because he dies in the end of 1799 of acute epiglottitis. And all of a sudden, it's a sudden death. It shocks the nation, and of course, shocks John Adams, our particular focus. How can we best characterize the relationship of 25 years? Adams, in his note to the Senate strikes a personal note where he said, I feel myself, that's the last drawing of Washington before he died, about a year or so before he actually dies. I feel myself alone, he says, bereaved by my lost brother. That's an interesting concept. I'm going to play with this just a minute in a different way because of the friction that's developed. I thought of the brothers, I thought of the biblical brothers, Cain and Abel, and their clash. Think of George Washington as Abel, the favored son, and think of Adams as Cain, the envious son. You remember the story in the Bible where they both present sacrifices to the Lord. Abel's is accepted and Cain's is rejected. Well, Washington and Adams sacrifice their lives in the pursuit of fame across the ages. How does it end up? Washington becomes the father of his country, first in the hearts of his countrymen, first in war, first in peace, etc. How does Adams end up down the ladder, and he feels that he's shortchanged because he's convinced in his own mind his contribution is as great. Now, I don't want to take the analogy too far. You know what happens in the Bible. Cain takes Abel out to a field and kills him. Certainly, Adams had no desire to kill George Washington. He reveres him in some ways. He even loves him. At one point, he uses that term. But I don't think he can camouflage the deep streak of envy he felt for Washington, any more than Cain could hide his envy of Abel. Adams dislikes the way a flawed man morphed into a mythical superhero. He interestingly wrote, he predicted that this is how the war would be written. The history of our revolution will be one continued lie. The essence of the whole will be Dr. Franklin's electro rod smote the earth, outsprung General Washington. Franklin electricized him with his rod, and henceforth, these two conducted all policy, negotiation, legislatures, and war. And there are lots of, when I read this more carefully, lots of examples of Adams' jealousy. He denigrates Washington's lack of education. He says he was clearly too illiterate to be president of the United States. When he lists Washington's talents, he etched a postscript in acid where he says, notice I've listed the talents, I've left out anything about reading, thinking, or writing. Pretty nasty note. He questioned whether Washington would have ever risen to an important position if he hadn't married the very wealthy widow, Custis. He once wrote that Washington was a successful swindler of men's laurels. He claimed that Washington personally benefited from moving the capital to the Potomac River, raising the value of his property by 1,000%. And I think most tellingly, he expressed great disappointment when his firstborn and favorite son, John Quincy Adams, who probably worth studying as well, named his first son George Washington Adams, and he did not like that. And I said some of his insights into Washington are excellent. One of my favorite quotes, which I wish I'd known about when I wrote my book, he says about Washington certainly did not know his own heart. He believed what he said of his aversion to public life and his attachment to retirement. But nothing could be further from the truth, the real temper of his mind. He knew not himself. He could not be easy in retirement. And he concluded Washington loved adulation and could not resist her charms. Now, that's very perceptive, but on the other hand, he'll write things like, you know why Washington wanted to come back into public life? Because he was jealous of all the fame that I'm getting in the aftermath of the XYZ affair. I read that and I said, lots of luck. It's just not accurate. Or why would he let Hamilton be second in command? Because Hamilton had something on him. He dominated him. He blackmailed him into getting a position at Yorktown to lead a command at Yorktown. Again, if you know George Washington, you ain't blackmailing George Washington. That's all there is. That's all there is to it. And I think, to me, Washington probably sensed some of this disdain for his limited education, for his envy. And it kept the men from being closer. It's kind of a sad ending to the story, because if things had been a little bit different, I think Washington underestimates. Adams is a remarkably brilliant, astute man. And under different circumstances, just like he used Hamilton's genius, maybe he could have used Adams' genius more effectively. But because of these bumps in the road and the attitudes and the envy and jealousy and his sensitivity to criticism, it doesn't work out that way. But I think our nation's really fortunate to have both of these men involved in the creation of our great nation. Washington for his charisma and leadership in creating the nation, and Adams for his contributions to independence, the writing of Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Paris, etc., and for his constitutional thought about constitutional conservative issues. Together, they gave us a priceless gift. But of course, how we use it is up to us. Thanks for your attention. Now, we'll have some time for Q&A. There's no foolish questions. There are lots of questions I'm not going to be able to answer, but you can bring them up if you wish to do so. So, with the understanding, no foolish questions, I'll take anything from the floor about the talk, or wider issues about Washington or Adams to the degree that I can. Yes.
After Washington died, what was the relationship among John Adams, Abigail Adams, and Martha Washington?
John Adams doesn't have much connection. Abigail Adams actually comes and visits Mount Vernon. She wrote some very nice comments. They were clearly friends. There's not a great deal left, and they're quite different in their. I mean, Abigail Adams is a remarkably brilliant woman. Martha Washington's an important woman, but does not. If you read her letters, they're very primitive in relationship to Abigail Adams. But they confide in each other, and Abigail Adams says Martha doesn't have a hint of haughtiness about her. They're very, very fond of each other and the family. So the fact that she took the trouble to come to Mount Vernon, and it was actually, I may be wrong, but I think it was to Abigail Adams where Martha talked about fear of the slaves and led her to free. Washington freed his slaves at the time of Martha's death, which meant if Martha dies, she was not comfortable, so she moved along to do that. Anybody else? Yes.
What's your history background?
My history background, I've got my Ph.D. at the University of Virginia in the late 60s.
Have you written other books?
Yes, I'm proud of two books. I'm proud of this book, First and Always, and I'm proud of my first major book, Realistic Visionary. They're not full biographies. They take a section, like Washington's relations with Jefferson, his views on slavery, religion, his his mother. Take things. The last years. I like to pick a topic and go into it in a little more depth than you can in a regular biography. Just like, there's lots of books will touch on Washington's relations with Adams, but unless you spend a lot of time, you're not going to see all of it kind of pulled together in one place. That's the kind of thing that I try to do. And I don't know whether the Cain Abel analogy is any good, but I've certainly never read it anywhere else. So we'll see. Other Comments or
Seems
questions?
to me, I've heard you speak before. Have you spoken here at the library?
Yes, I did before, once with Dave, and then earlier, years ago in a different place when someone else was in charge. I know I spoke on Washington and Hamilton and the truth between the musical, the reality of the musical. I remember doing that. So if they invite me back, I'll do the Abigail and Martha in the relationships. I think I'm looking forward to doing some work on it and see what I find.
In the series that they show when Adams is inaugurated president, Washington says, "I'm fairly out, you're fairly in. We'll see who's happier." If where that exchange comes from, and then they also show the Adams moving into the presidential mansion, and it looks like the Washingtons took everything out of there and kind of left them.
Both are based on its historical evidence. Washington wrote his wife afterwards and said, "Methought, as I looked at him, methought he was saying, 'You're in, I'm out, see who's going to be happier.'" He wrote that. And at first, I don't doubt for a minute that's absolutely how Washington felt. And there was a dispute over the furniture. Washington took some back to Mount Vernon, hoped that Adams would buy some of the pieces that he left. And Adams was not happy with what was there, and later actually felt that Washington had tried to gouge him on the price of a couple of old horses. So there is an historical basis for it. Maybe as all, it's very tricky when you take facts and put them into a regular thing. I mean, I can watch shows and say, that's not right. Well, you do it. I can't. I can just say, no, that didn't get it right. But you have to, and that within the framework, it's a pretty good series. I would rank it as a good historical treatment of an interesting subject, and it helped Adams get more popular. Now if someone wrote a musical on him, remember, in Hamilton's musical, Adams doesn't do very well. When I didn't give you the quote, when they get mad, when I said what Adams thought about Hamilton, in the musical, you have just the opposite. It's got a curse word I've got to modify. But Hamilton says, "John, sit down, you fat mother." And that's kind of set the stage for the way they're going to view each other. Anyone else? Well, if you've got personal questions you want to ask, I'll be happy to answer. I brought a few books with me. If you want to buy a book for you or a friend, I'll be happy to sign them. And as I say, they were $20. But it's always nice on a rainy night to have people willing to come out and listen. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.